Over the New Year's weekend, 9,100 people visited this building to view the original Emancipation Proclamation. Some stood in line for hours for the chance to read the words declaring that slaves and states in rebellion shall be then, thenceforth, and forever free, and to see Abraham Lincoln's signature. Although the Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery in America, it fundamentally changed the character of the war. Overnight, a war to preserve the Union became a war for human liberation. For the nearly 4 million slaves held in bondage, it was a symbol of hope. That hope of freedom was finally realized in the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which abolished slavery any place under U.S. jurisdiction. These two landmark documents of freedom reside here at the National Archives. But our shelves are filled with documents that tell the story of emancipation on the individual level. A letter from a black soldier to his still enslaved wife assures her that though the present national difficulties are great, yet I look forward to a brighter day. An enslaved woman asked President Lincoln if she were free following the Emancipation Proclamation. Sadly, the answer was no, because she lived in Maryland, a border state unaffected by the decree. First-person accounts of former slaves that appear in some military pension files provide a window onto the world before and after the war. Some talk of choosing a name to bear as a free person, and others describe long searches to reunite their families. Milestones long denied to an enslaved population, marriage, going to school, owning land, now become possible for freed people. And our tremendous holdings of Freedmen's Bureau records contain stories of their struggles and achievements. The historians on the panel have combed these records and more here and at other research institutions in their own investigations. We're delighted to have them with us tonight. Leading the discussion tonight is Annette Gordon-Reed, a Pulitzer Prize winner and professor of American Legal History at Harvard Law School, professor of history at Harvard University, and professor at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies. Joining her are James McPherson, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian and professor emeritus at Princeton University, Edward Ayers, Civil War historian, author, and president of the University of Richmond, Eric Foner, historian, author, and professor of history at Columbia University, and James Oakes, professor of history at City University of New York and the author of Freedom National, the topic of tonight's discussion. A book which was researched at the New York Public Library at the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers when I was the director of libraries at the New York Public Library. All the panelists will sign books in the theater lobby after the program. Please join me in welcoming them to the stage.
Good evening. I'm glad to see all of you here, a wonderful audience. We're going to have a conversation, we hope, spend about an hour discussing amongst ourselves, with you listening, and then we will take questions from the audience. So I hope, and I'm sure you have a lot of them, and I hope you will not be shy about asking them. I want to start out first with Jim and asking you a question about the book, about the title of the book, and some terms you use that people may not understand. Freedom National, the one.
Freedom National. It comes from a speech that Charles Sumner gave, his inaugural speech as a U.S. Senator. The speech was called Freedom National, Slavery Sectional. And it refers to two things. So the first is that it's a constitutional doctrine that political abolitionists and anti-slavery politicians had formulated, by which they could, in which they claimed that the Constitution made slavery strictly a local state institution, but that everywhere the Constitution was sovereign, freedom was to be the policy of the United States. So it's a constitutional document that said on the high seas, in Washington, D.C., in the Western Territories, freedom should be the policy of the national government. And second, it meant logically a series of policies that the federal government could undertake in order to make freedom national and slavery sectional, thereby putting slavery, hopefully, on what Lincoln called the course of ultimate extinction.
Mm-hmm. And it was important for you. Why was it? When did you decide that you were going to use that as your title? What was the moment you thought that this is the thing that was going to convey what you most wanted to know about, wanted people to know about this era and this time?
Well, it it was the discovery that we tend to write about emancipation as something that starts entirely with the war. And it was the discovery that the Republicans came into the war with a set of policies they intended to pursue to make freedom national based on this very controversial doctrine of what they believed the Constitution did and did not allow. So my book is mostly about the origins and evolution of anti-slavery policy during the war, and I discovered that there are more antebellum origins, pre-Civil War origins, than I had anticipated. And Freedom National captures the organizing framework for anti-slavery politicians.
So you think this is against the consensus, a conventional wisdom about the emancipation story? Is it you're out to overturn something? Or have people have a different view about it? Let's put it that way.
Well, to the extent that to the extent that people argue that the Republicans come into the war denying any intention of interfering with slavery, and that as a consequence, maybe emancipation was an accident, it was inadvertent, it was something nobody intended to happen. To that extent, and there are historians who make that claim, I am up against them, yes.
Ed, why do you think, because this is obviously an issue that isn't just in the past, it's here now and people are arguing about it. Why is it important to say that Lincoln and that the Republicans sort of came to this later on and that this wasn't a part of the original story?
I've had a lot of discussions over the last 4 years with people, and I think in most audiences there's somebody who wants to resist that idea. And a lot of skepticism about, frankly, I spoke at a school in New York yesterday, and one young African-American man said, isn't it true we just needed a white hero, and that they just hanged that story on him because it couldn't really address the fact that, slaves basically forced this upon him and so forth. So I find that that even though Lincoln is venerated in so many quarters, there's also a lot of deep skepticism.
I was going to ask you about that. There's a lot of rehabilitating of him that would have to be done. There are a lot of people who really have problems with him, not just the Confederates.
Again, talking to these high school, and they had pretty focused problems with him. But talking to these high school kids yesterday, they point to all the anomalies. Well, if he believed that, why is he still talking about colonization so late? If he believed that, why didn't he have a plan for Reconstruction? If he did believe that, why is he still writing that letter to Horace Greeley and all that? So I think that Jim's right, that there is even though people recognize that Lincoln is somehow responsible, people are just, it may be some projection of today's cynicism, of thinking, well, he can't really have guided us through all that. It must have been sort of controlling him to some extent. So I think there's a folk knowledge that Lincoln was really racist, and that therefore we can't really give him all the credit. And then there's a scholarly knowledge who knows about all these other kinds of countervailing evidence that suggests that Jim finds the thread that ties this all together. They're all focused on the knots of contradictory evidence.
And specifically about the Republicans, we can come back to that. At what point do they begin to develop a plan about this? So you get some sense that there's consensus that they really are going to go after slavery.
Yeah, it's pretty clear to me. Well, I backed into this. I started the usual place that most historians start the story of emancipation, with Fortress Monroe, and then I went on to the First Confiscation Act, and I was trying to figure out, most of the historians write about the First Confiscation Act and say it didn't do anything, and then I decided, well, why did they bother passing it? What was it all about? And I discovered that they were all talking about emancipation. It was understood to be an emancipation law, and I saw there was a full-scale debate on emancipation. This is the summer of 1861, the first summer of the war. Congress is called into a special session 5 months ahead of schedule, and they pass this law that begins emancipation. And 2 days after they pass the law, Lincoln signs it on the 6th, and 2 days later, the War Department issues the instructions to begin emancipating. So, well, they couldn't have thought this up right away. I went back and looked, and sure enough, all during the secession crisis, the Republicans are saying, you leave the Union, we're going to start emancipating slaves. And then I said, where did that come from? And I just kept backing up, and I ended up all the way in the 18th century, saying, where these ideas come from. And like that.
It really is a grand old party.
But it's one of the things I understand. I understand the resistance about Lincoln, because I do think people have a hard time coming to any reasonable